Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the first lesson of the class year. We're going to really basically kind of cover an introduction to Ruth. And so, actually Ruth and Samuel. Okay, so while I was in Tucson last month, I heard two cowboys trying to out-brag each other regarding how big their property was. Well, one cowboy puffed out his chest and said, "I guess I have about 1,000 acres of land. How big is your spread?" And the other cowboy stated, "I rightly don't know. I get up in my pickup in the morning and travel until evening, and I'm still on my property." Now, first cowboy says, "Yep, I once had a pickup like that. In fact, I do have one like that." Okay, I hope you all had a great summer break. Linda, my wife, and I managed to spend a couple of weeks with our daughter in Tucson, taking care of the grandkids while she and her husband worked. We also spent almost a whole month at our cabin in Washington State, where we hosted family gatherings and did a little grandkid watching for our son who lives up there in that state. So all in all, it was a wonderful and exhausting time of it. And we don't seem to be getting any younger either. And after all that living and freedom and pursuit of happiness, it's really good to return to the study of God's Word. So let's get started. The Old Testament books of Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel tell the faith stories of men and women just like us. Yeah, well, they might have been prophets or priests or kings, but they were also sons and daughters, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. They struggled in the same ways we do. They experienced deferred hopes and dreams, broken relationships, shameful failures, and personal trauma, just as we do. The thing is, it's what they did with those disappointments that really matter. And in this study, we'll see people who took their pain and anger to God, and those who didn't. And in either case, we'll see how God remained faithful to his people, plans, and purposes. The lesson commentary says that the most unchanging thing about life is that it's always changing. We're never stuck for long, always in some stage of transition. The stories contained in Ruth and Samuel take place during periods of great transition for the people of Israel, and we see that transition played out in the lives we're about to study. So out of a time of the judges, where Israel didn't have a single leader and everyone did what they thought was right, which was pretty much all wrong, comes the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. In it, we see God's involvement in individual lives and ultimately how it all works to further God's wise plan for redemption through his son, Jesus. We're only going to spend 1 week on the book of Ruth, but don't worry, it consists of just 4 chapters and it's an easy read. In Ruth, we'll encounter real people who experience tough times and who show us what loyalty looks like, what faith and trust can do, and how God is always working behind the scenes, moving steadily forward with his plans for salvation. Now, I don't want to give away any of the best parts of this story, so I'll just stop there. Be sure to do a good job with the lesson questions for next week and bring your thoughts and observations as well as your own questions to your core group discussion. With lesson 3, we begin our study of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're actually one book in the Hebrew manuscript. The split in 2 is thought to be related to either its content or its length. 1 Samuel ends with the death of King Saul, and the 2nd takes up the reign of King David. Kind of a nice break there. course, it's also possible that two smaller manuscripts were easy to handle than one large roll. The book of Ruth is all about three main characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. The same can be said about Samuel. Well, loosely, they are Samuel, Saul, and David. Speaking of David, I'm sure that all of you have seen a photo of Michelangelo's statue of David, right? Some of you may have actually seen the sculpture in person in Florence, Italy. It's really quite something. Well, that reminds me of some friends of a friend who traveled all the way to Italy and on to Florence to see David. Well, if you've been to Florence, there is a copy of the famous statue in this piazza here, along with a breathtaking view of the city below. Unfortunately, these friends took this copy to be the real thing, and they left Italy never having actually seen Michelangelo's David. Well, even if you have seen Michelangelo's original, you still haven't seen the real David until you've studied 1st and 2nd Samuel and read his Psalms. Now, make no mistake, the books of Samuel are crammed with fascinating individuals and stories. They also contain elements that are troubling and disturbing for Christians who read them. For instance, there's a great deal of violence in these accounts, and often done at God's direction. Dealing with these is a challenge, and what has helped me personally is to try and understand the context of those ancient times, as well as the needs of those stories who met the requirements and the needs of the people who was reading them at the time. The leap, though, is then to find their relevance for us today. Well, maybe more importantly, it's understanding the nature of our God, that he is holy and his plans overrule human affairs, and great and small, and neither does he explain himself. Ken Chafin, in his commentary on 1st and 2nd Samuel, says, if we look at these books through the eyes of a people desperate for hope, there are several basic ideas about God that emerge, which are illustrated over and over again. God always acts in the best interest of his people. God always calls appropriate leaders for his work and uses them to move his plan along. And God is at work in the most minute details of history, working out his purpose for those that love him and keep his commands. And another thing to remember as you study these ancient accounts of God working in the lives of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and Samuel, Saul, and David, is this same unchanging God is the God who works in you and me today, working out his plan and purposes through the details of our lives. This is a key message in the books we're about to read and study. Our introductory lesson, one commentary, closes with the following questions. How aware are you of God's involvement in your own life? And where do you see him at work? Where do you wish you could see him more clearly working? The theme for this year is God is faithful. And our theme verse from Romans chapter 8, verses 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Even amid chaos, God's wise plan for us and our redemption moves steadily forward. Will you and I entrust our hopes and heartaches to God's wise plan? Okay, well, have a great week ahead and see you next week.